There is a place where the earth itself becomes the enemy, where the sun doesn't simply shine, it burns through skin, through thought, through hope, where shadows offer no refuge and the horizon shimmers with lies. A place so vast and so empty that men vanish into it like whispers into wind. This place is the North African desert, and in the summer of 1942, it was devouring an army. They stumbled forward in broken columns, Italian soldiers, faces blackened by dust and sun, uniforms bleached nearly white by the relentless glare. Their boots dragged through sand that burned like coals. Each step was a negotiation with collapse. Each breath tasted of copper and ash. The temperature had climbed past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. At that heat, metal becomes untouchable. Truck engines seize and die. Rifles too hot to hold are dropped into the sand. Water, when there is any, evaporates before it can quench. The body begins to shut down organ by organ as dehydration pulls the moisture from blood, from muscle, from the brain itself. And still they marched. Sergeant Giuseppe Mariani had stopped sweating hours ago. That was the first sign. When the body has nothing left to give, it simply stops trying. His lips were cracked so deeply they bled when he spoke. His tongue, swollen and dry, filled his mouth like a foreign object. He could barely form words anymore, but he didn't need to. The men around him understood. They all felt it. The slow, creeping certainty that the desert would take them. Not the British, not bullets or bombs. The heat, the thirst, the sand that worked its way into every crevice, every wound, grinding them down grain by grain. Private Luca Berardi collapsed first. He simply stopped walking, his knees buckling beneath him as though invisible hands had pulled him to the ground. His eyes stared at nothing. His chest rose and fell in shallow, desperate gasps. Two of his comrades tried to lift him, but their own strength was gone. They lowered him gently into the sand and moved on. There was no choice. Behind them, the convoy of trucks and supply vehicles had long since fallen apart. Engines overheated and blown, wheels buried axle-deep in dunes, canvas tarps flapping uselessly in the wind. The column stretched for miles, a graveyard of steel and rubber, punctuated by the bodies of men who could walk no further. They had been sent here to fight, but the desert killed faster than any enemy ever could. Corporal Antonio Rizzo knelt beside a dried riverbed, a wadi, and clawed at the sand with bare hands, searching for moisture. His fingernails split. His palms bled. He found nothing. Only more sand. Only more heat. Above him, the sky burned a white so bright it hurt to look at. No clouds, no birds, just the sun, hanging like a furnace door left open, pouring fire onto the earth below. This was not war as they had imagined it. There were no trenches here, no fortifications, no clear lines between friend and enemy. There was only the endless, shifting emptiness of the Libyan desert, a sea of sand and stone that stretched farther than the eye could see, farther than the mind could comprehend. And in that emptiness, men became ghosts. Lieutenant Marco Bellini watched his platoon disintegrate. 38 men had started the march. Now, fewer than 20 remained upright. The rest lay scattered behind them, half buried already by the wind. He had no radio, no map that mattered, no orders that made sense anymore. They were supposed to rendezvous with a supply depot, but the depot was gone, bombed, abandoned, or perhaps never there at all. In the chaos of retreat, information became as unreliable as the mirages that danced along the horizon. Bellini had stopped trusting his eyes days ago. He had seen lakes that weren't there, cities that dissolved into air, entire armies that vanished when he blinked. The desert played tricks, and the heat made those tricks feel real. He turned to look at his men, at what was left of them. Their faces were hollow, eyes sunken deep into skulls. They looked like the photographs he'd seen of the Great War, of men broken by years in the trenches. But this had taken only weeks. Weeks of marching, weeks of thirst, weeks of watching friends die not from bullets, but from the simple, brutal fact of being human in a place that did not care. One of the soldiers, Berardi's tentmate, a boy from Calabria named Matteo, sat down in the sand and began to cry. Not the loud, choking sobs of grief, but the quiet, empty tears of someone who has nothing left. His body shook, his hands trembled. No one stopped him, because they all felt it too. The realization that they had been sent to die, not in battle, not in some heroic charge or desperate last stand, but here, in the middle of nowhere, beneath a sun that would not forgive and a sky that would not answer. Mariani knelt beside Matteo and placed a hand on his shoulder. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. After a moment, Matteo stood, wiped his face with a filthy sleeve, and kept walking, because that was all they could do: walk and hope. And die slowly. The North African campaign was supposed to be glorious, a return to the Empire of Rome, a conquest of sand and sea that would restore Italy's pride, its power, its place in the world. But glory does not survive 120 degrees. It melts. It evaporates. It becomes another mirage, shimmering just out of reach, always one step farther than you can walk. And as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, offering no relief, only a different shade of agony, the column of Italian soldiers dragged itself forward into the gathering dusk. Behind them, the desert erased their footprints. Ahead, it waited, patient, endless, hungry. This was the North African front, and for the men who fought there, survival was not a matter of courage or strategy or firepower. It was a matter of enduring one more hour, one more step, one more breath in a place designed to take them all away. But to understand how they came to be here, how thousands of young Italian men found themselves trapped in this hell of heat and sand, we must turn back the clock, back to a time when the desert was still a dream wrapped in flags and speeches and promises of greatness. A dream called empire. It began, as so many disasters do, with ambition. In the spring of 1940, Benito Mussolini stood before a map of the Mediterranean and saw not nations, but destiny. He saw the shadow of Rome stretching across North Africa, across the deserts and coasts his ancestors had conquered 2,000 years before. He saw an empire, and he believed, ease with the fervor of a man intoxicated by his own propaganda, that Italy could reclaim. We will rebuild what was lost, he declared, his voice booming through the halls of power in Rome. We will restore the glory of the Caesars. The Mediterranean will once again become Mare Nostrum, our sea. It was a seductive vision. Italy had been humiliated before, defeated in Ethiopia in the 1890s, denied spoils after the Great War despite fighting on the winning side, treated as a second-rate power by France and Britain, mocked by Germany, dismissed by the world. But now in 1940, the moment seemed ripe. France was collapsing under the Nazi blitzkrieg. Britain stood alone, bloodied and desperate. And Mussolini, eager to claim his share of the spoils before the war ended, made his move. On June 10, 1940, Italy declared war on France and Britain. 4 months later, Italian forces crossed the border from Libya into Egypt, marching east toward the Suez Canal, the artery of the British Empire, the gateway to Asia, the prize that would prove Italy's might. It was supposed to be swift, decisive, glorious. It was none of those things. The soldiers who marched into Egypt that September were not the legions of Rome. They were farmers and factory workers, clerks and shepherds, boys barely out of school, who had been handed rifles and uniforms and told they were conquerors. Many had never fired a weapon before. Most had never seen a desert, and almost none of them understood why they were there till Private Giulio Conti, a 22-year-old from a village outside Turin, wrote home in those early days. They tell us we are fighting for empire, but I don't know what that means. I only know that the sand gets in everything, and the sun never stops. The Italian army that entered North Africa was vast on paper, over 200,000 men, supported by tanks, artillery, and aircraft. But the reality was far grimmer. The tanks were outdated, many of them L3 tankettes, tiny, lightly armored vehicles that could barely withstand machine gun fire, let alone anti-tank rounds. They overheated constantly in the desert, their engines choking on sand and dust. The trucks were worse. Civilian models pressed into military service, they broke down with alarming frequency. Spare parts were scarce. Mechanics improvised with wire and hope, and the rifles, the Carcano M91, jammed in the sand. The bolts seized. The triggers stuck. Soldiers learned quickly that their weapons were as likely to fail as to fire, but the greatest failure was not in equipment, it was in planning. The Italian High Command had assumed the desert would be like any other battlefield, a place where tactics and training and discipline would decide the outcome. They had not accounted for the heat, the distances, the absolute scarcity of water and shade. They had not accounted for the desert itself. Supply lines stretched back hundreds of miles, across terrain with no roads, no landmarks, no reliable maps. Convoys got lost. Fuel ran out. Food spoiled in the heat. Water, the most precious resource of all, was rationed so tightly that men received less than a liter a day, barely enough to survive, let alone fight, and the British were waiting. In December 1940, the British launched Operation Compass, a counter-offensive that shattered the Italian advance in a matter of weeks. British tanks, better armed and better supplied, tore through Italian positions. Infantry, supported by artillery and air power, overwhelmed defenses that had been hastily dug into the sand. The Italians fought, but they were not ready for this. Corporal Stefano Rossi, pinned down in a trench near Sidi Barani, watched as British Matilda tanks rolled over Italian positions like they were made of paper. "We fired everything we had," he later recalled. "Our bullets bounced off their armor, and then they were on top of us." Within 2 months, the British had pushed the Italians back over 500 miles. Capturing more than 130,000 prisoners, entire divisions surrendered, not because they were cowards, but because they had no water. No ammunition, no hope. The dream of empire was already dying, but Mussolini refused to see it. In Rome, he raged at his generals, blamed his soldiers, and demanded victory. He could not accept that his grand vision had been built on sand, both literally and figuratively, and so the war continued. More men were sent, more tanks, more promises, but the fundamental problems remained. Italy's industrial base could not keep pace with the demands of modern warfare. Its logistics were chaotic. Its leadership, fractured by rivalries and yes-men, failed to adapt to the brutal realities of desert combat, and the soldiers paid the price. Lieutenant Carlo Mancini, stationed at a supply depot in Benghazi, wrote in his diary, "Every day more trucks arrive and half of them broken. Every day more men, half of them sick. We are told to prepare for the next offensive. But I do not know how we can fight when we can barely feed ourselves." The mirage of empire, so vivid in Mussolini's imagination, was evaporating in the heat. But illusions die slowly, especially when they are wrapped in flags and speeches and the weight of national pride. The Italian soldiers in North Africa did not fight for ideology. Most of them did not care about empire or destiny or Mare Nostrum. They fought because they had been ordered to, because their families were watching, because turning back was not an option. They fought because they were human and because, deep down, they hoped that someone, somewhere, knew what they were doing. But as 1940 turned to 1941, as the defeats mounted and the desert closed in, that hope began to fade. The British were not the only enemy now. The heat was an enemy. The thirst was an enemy. The sand was an enemy. And the worst part was this: the desert did not care who you were, what flag you carried, or what dreams you had brought with you. It took everyone equally, slowly, relentlessly, without mercy. By the time the first year of the North African campaign ended, tens of thousands of Italian soldiers were dead, captured, or missing. The supply lines were in chaos, morale was crumbling, and the mirage of empire, that shimmering vision of Roman glory reborn, was dissolving into the haze. But Mussolini, desperate and defiant, made one final gamble. He called for help, and help arrived. In February 1941, a German general named Erwin Rommel stepped off a plane in Tripoli, bringing with him the Afrika Korps, and a new kind of nightmare for the Italian soldiers already dying in the sand. The Italians thought salvation had come. They were wrong. By the winter of 1941, the North African front had become a graveyard in slow motion. It was not the kind of graveyard you could see. Not yet. There were no rows of white crosses, no monuments, no solemn ceremonies, but death was there, woven into every gust of wind, every shimmering heat wave, every dried riverbed that promised water and delivered only dust. The Italian army was unraveling, not in a single catastrophic battle, but in 1,000 small collapses, each one barely noticed, each one fatal. Sergeant Enzo Lombardi stood at the edge of a supply depot outside Tobruk, staring at the empty crates stacked haphazardly in the sand. They had arrived 3 days late, carried by a convoy that had lost half its trucks to breakdowns and air raids. When the crates were finally opened, they contained rations meant for a different unit, artillery shells that didn't fit Italian guns, and medical supplies that had spoiled in the heat. "Nothing," he muttered to no one in particular. "We have nothing." It was the truth. The supply lines that stretched back across Libya to Italy were barely functioning. Ships carrying food, fuel, and ammunition were being sunk by British submarines and aircraft in the Mediterranean. Those that made it to port faced another gauntlet. Roads that didn't exist, trucks that couldn't survive the desert, and distances so vast that supplies often ran out before they reached the front. The soldiers felt it first in their stomachs. Rations were cut, then cut again. Men who had once received pasta, bread, and canned meat now subsisted on hardtack biscuits and whatever they could scavenge. Some bartered with Bedouin nomads, trading watches and cigarettes for dates and goat milk. Others ate insects, roots, anything that might keep the hunger at bay for another day. But hunger was only the beginning. Water, the single most critical resource in the desert, was running out. Private Alessandro Marini watched as his platoon's daily water ration was reduced to 3/4 of a liter per man, then half a liter, then less. The water itself, when it came, was warm, metallic tasting, often contaminated. Dysentery spread through the ranks like wildfire. Men who had survived British artillery now found themselves crippled by diarrhea, vomiting, dehydration. They lay in makeshift field hospitals, tents with no medicine, no beds, no hope, while flies swarmed over them in black, buzzing clouds. The flies were everywhere. They covered food the moment it was unwrapped. They crawled into mouths, eyes, wounds. They laid eggs in open sores, and within days, maggots writhed beneath the skin. Soldiers learned to sleep with cloth wrapped around their faces, but it made breathing harder, made the heat worse, made everything worse, and the heat never stopped. Even in winter, the desert sun was merciless. By midday, the temperature climbed past 100 degrees. The sand became a skillet. Men who fell unconscious from heat stroke were often found hours later, blistered and delirious. Their skin cracked like old leather. Corporal Fabio Conti tried to describe it in a letter home. Imagine an oven. Now imagine you cannot leave. Now imagine the oven is the size of the world. That is where we are. He never sent the letter. There was no way to send it. The mail convoys had stopped weeks ago. The isolation was suffocating. Soldiers on the front lines went weeks without news from home, without orders from command, without any sense that anyone, anywhere, remembered they existed. Some units, cut off during British advances, wandered the desert for days trying to find friendly lines. Many never did. Lieutenant Pietro Gambino's company was one of those. They had been holding a position near Bardia when the British attacked at dawn. The assault was overwhelming. Tanks, artillery, waves of infantry supported by airstrikes. Gambino ordered a retreat, but in the chaos his men scattered. By nightfall he had only 16 soldiers left, and no idea where the rest of the Italian army was. They walked south for 3 days. No water, no food, no map. On the second day they found a burned-out convoy. Italian trucks bombed into twisted metal. Among the wreckage they found canteens, most of them empty, but a few still containing a few mouthfuls of water. They shared it, rationing every drop. On the third day, one of the younger soldiers, a boy from Sicily named Luca, began hallucinating. He spoke to people who weren't there. He saw his mother in the distance waving to him. He started walking toward her. They tried to stop him, but he pulled away, stumbling into the desert, calling her name. Gambino sent 2 men after him, but they returned empty-handed. Luca had simply vanished into the haze. They left him behind, because there was no other choice. By the time Gambino's group stumbled into a German encampment, only 9 of them remained. The Germans gave them water, food, and directions, but when Gambino asked about the rest of the Italian forces, the German officer just shook his head. Scattered, he said, or captured. The British offensive, Operation Compass, and later Operation Crusader, had shattered the Italian front. Entire divisions had been encircled and forced to surrender. Others retreated in disorder, abandoning equipment, vehicles, sometimes even their wounded. The prisoners numbered in the tens of thousands. They marched in long columns through the desert, guarded by British and Commonwealth troops, their hands raised, their faces blank with exhaustion. Some were relieved. For them, the war was over. They would spend the rest of it in camps, far from the heat and the thirst and the death, but others felt only shame. Not because they had surrendered, many had fought until they had nothing left, but because the world would see them as failures, as cowards. As the army that could not even conquer sand. Sergeant Lombardi, who had been captured near Tobruk, later recalled the moment he laid down his rifle. I was not afraid of the British. I was afraid of going home, of my father asking me why I did not fight harder, of my village knowing I was captured, but I had no ammunition left, no water, no strength. What was I supposed to do? Die for nothing? The question haunted him for the rest of his life, and it haunted Italy, because the defeats in North Africa were not just military failures. They were symbolic ones. They exposed the hollowness of Mussolini's promises, the weakness of Italy's war machine, the gap between propaganda and reality. Back in Rome, the government tried to spin the losses as strategic withdrawals, as temporary setbacks, as necessary sacrifices, but the soldiers knew better. They knew they had been sent to die for a dream that was never real, and the worst part was this. The nightmare was not over, because in February 1941, as the Italian army lay broken and bleeding in the sand, a new force arrived, a force that promised salvation, a force led by a man named Rommel. The German Afrika Korps rolled into Libya with tanks that worked, supply lines that functioned, and a reputation for invincibility. The Italians watched them arrive, the clean uniforms, the disciplined movements, the confidence that came from winning wars, and for a moment, they allowed themselves to hope. Perhaps the Germans would turn the tide. Perhaps the alliance would bring victory. Perhaps all the suffering, all the death, all the heat and thirst and sand would finally mean something. But hope in the desert is the cruelest mirage of all, because what the Italian soldiers did not yet understand was that the arrival of Rommel did not mean they would be saved. It meant they would be overshadowed. Their courage would be forgotten beneath German propaganda. Their sacrifices would be buried under Rommel's legend. Their names would disappear from history, replaced by a single narrative, the Desert Fox and his brilliant campaigns. And the Italians, they would become footnotes, invisible men dying in invisible wars, remembered by no one. But that realization came later. For now, as the German tanks rolled past the scattered Italian positions, the soldiers could only watch and wonder, and hope, just a little longer, that someone cared. When Rommel arrived in North Africa, he brought with him more than just tanks and soldiers. He brought a myth, the story of the Desert Fox, brilliant, audacious, unstoppable, would be written in the years to come. It would fill books and films, inspire admiration even among his enemies, and cement his place as one of history's great military commanders. But for the Italian soldiers fighting beside him, Rommel's arrival meant something else entirely. It meant becoming ghosts. At first there was relief, even joy. When the German Afrika Korps rolled into Tripoli in February 1941, Italian troops lined the streets to watch them pass. The Panzer III and IV tanks gleamed in the sun, their engines roaring with mechanical precision. The German soldiers sat upright, helmets polished, eyes sharp. They looked like what an army was supposed to look like. And for men who had been fighting with broken equipment and empty stomachs, the sight was intoxicating. "They will save us," Private Marco Silvestri whispered to his friend, watching the convoy rumble past. "With them we can win." It was a thought echoed across the Italian ranks. Finally, they had real support. Finally, they had allies who knew how to fight in the desert. Finally, the war would turn in their favor. But the reality was far more complicated. Rommel was a tactician of genius, a commander who understood mobility and surprise better than almost anyone alive. He moved fast, struck hard, and vanished before the enemy could respond. His campaigns in the spring and summer of 1941 pushed the British back across hundreds of miles, reclaiming territory that Italy had lost. But the victories came at a cost, and the Italians paid it. Rommel's strategy relied on speed and firepower. German speed, German firepower. The panzers led the assault. The Luftwaffe provided air cover. The German infantry held the critical positions, and the Italians, they held the flanks. They defended the rear. They occupied the static positions, while the Germans maneuvered. They dug the trenches, unloaded the supplies, and died in the places no one would remember. It was not that Rommel despised the Italians. In his letters and reports, he sometimes praised their courage, but he did not trust their equipment, their training, or their leadership. And in the brutal calculus of desert warfare, trust determined who lived and who died. The German units received priority in everything: fuel, ammunition, food, water. When supplies were short, the Italians went without. When reinforcements were needed, the Germans were pulled back to safety, while the Italians were left to hold impossible lines. Captain Enrico Bianchi, commanding an artillery battery near Tobruk, watched as German convoys passed his position, loaded with fresh rations and spare parts. His own men had been eating stale bread and canned sardines for 2 weeks. Their guns were so worn that half of them misfired. He submitted a request for supplies. It was denied. "German units have priority," the quartermaster told him. "You will receive what is left." There was never anything left. The bitterness grew slowly, quietly, like rust on metal. In the field, Italian and German soldiers sometimes fought side by side. They shared cigarettes, sheltered together during sandstorms, and joked in broken fragments of each other's languages. There was camaraderie there, real human connection, but beneath it was something else, a hierarchy, an unspoken understanding that the Germans were the real army, and the Italians were something less. Sergeant Giuseppe Ferraro felt it in the way German officers spoke to him, polite but condescending, like teachers addressing children. He felt it in the way German soldiers looked at Italian equipment and shook their heads. He felt it in the orders that came down from command, always framed as suggestions, but carrying the weight of inevitability. "Your men will hold this position," a German lieutenant told him one afternoon, pointing to a ridge overlooking an empty stretch of desert. "We will advance past you and engage the British. When we break through, you will follow." "And if the British counterattack?" Ferraro asked. The lieutenant paused, then smiled, a thin, humorless expression. "Then you will hold as long as you can." Translation: "You will die so that we do not have to." Ferraro said nothing. There was nothing to say. He returned to his men and relayed the orders. They dug in, set up their machine guns, and waited. The British attacked 3 hours later. Shells rained down on the ridge, turning the sand into geysers of fire and rock. The Italian soldiers fired back, their old rifles cracking in the heat. They held for 20 minutes, then 30, then an hour. The Germans did not come back. When the British infantry finally overran the position, only 6 of Ferraro's men were still alive. He was not one of them. His body was found 2 days later by a German patrol. They buried him quickly without ceremony and moved on. No one recorded his name. This was the pattern. Italian units were deployed to the hardest, most thankless positions. They defended sieges at Tobruk, where they were shelled day and night for months. They held the line at El Agheila, while the Germans regrouped. They fought at Gazala, at Bir Hakeim, at a dozen other places that history would remember only as footnotes, and when those positions fell, it was Italian blood that soaked into the sand. Private Domenico Rossi, pinned down during the siege of Tobruk, wrote in his diary, "We are told we fight for the same cause, but when the food comes, it goes to them. When the reinforcements come, they go to them. When the retreat is called, they leave first. We are brothers," they say, but brothers do not leave each other behind. He was killed a week later by a stray shell. His diary was never recovered. The world, meanwhile, fell in love with Rommel. Newspapers in Germany hailed him as a hero. The British, despite fighting him, admired his chivalry and skill. Even decades later, his campaigns would be studied in military academies, his tactics dissected and celebrated, and the Italians, they became the supporting cast in someone else's story. When historians wrote about North Africa, they wrote about Rommel and the Afrika Korps. They wrote about Montgomery and the Eighth Army. They wrote about tanks and tactics, and the great clashes of armor in the sand, but the Italian soldiers are the men who died, holding positions no one cared about, who fought with weapons that barely worked, who endured the same heat and thirst and fear as they were footnotes, background noise, failures. Even in Italy, the narrative shifted. After the war, when the country was trying to rebuild its identity, the North African campaign became an embarrassment, a reminder of weakness, of defeat, of alliances with the wrong side. The veterans who returned were told quietly but firmly to forget, to move on, to let the past stay buried, and so they did. Corporal Luca Martini, who survived Tobruk and El Alamein and the long retreat across Libya, came home in 1943 to a village that did not want to hear his stories. His father asked him once over dinner what it had been like. Martini opened his mouth to answer. Then he saw the look in his father's eyes, the discomfort, the shame, the unspoken plea to let it go. So he closed his mouth. He never spoke of it again, not to his family, not to his children, not to anyone. The desert became a secret he carried alone, locked away in the part of his mind where the heat still shimmered, and the sand still burned, and the faces of dead friends still haunted him in the dark. He was not the only one. Across Italy, thousands of veterans returned and said nothing. They buried their memories the way they had buried their comrades, quickly, quietly, without ceremony, and the world forgot them. But the tragedy was not just in the forgetting, it was in the knowing, because the Italian soldiers in North Africa were not cowards. They were not weak. They did not lack courage, they lacked support. They lacked equipment. They lacked a command structure that valued their lives as much as it valued headlines. They fought in conditions that would have broken any army. And they endured longer than most would have. But endurance without recognition is a special kind of cruelty. And when Rommel left North Africa in 1943, recalled to Europe as the tide of war turned, the Italians were still there, still fighting, still dying, still invisible. The shadow he had cast over them did not lift with his departure. It remained, and it remains still, because even now, when people think of the North African campaign, they think of the desert fox. They think of panzers rolling across the dunes, of brilliant maneuvers and daring raids. They do not think of the Italian private who died of thirst in a foxhole, or the Italian sergeant who held a ridge for 3 hours so the Germans could retreat, or the Italian captain who wrote letters home that were never answered. They do not think of the men who fought in the shadow of a legend and were erased by... But those men were real, and their suffering was real, and perhaps that is the greatest tragedy of all. That courage without glory is so easily forgotten, and so the desert kept their names, buried beneath the sand, waiting for someone to remember. In the desert, survival was not a matter of strength. It was a matter of adaptation, of learning to live in a place that was designed to kill you, of finding small mercies in a landscape that offered none, of becoming something other than what you were, something harder, quieter, more desperate. The Italian soldiers who endured the North African campaign became masters of this terrible art. They learned to read the sky for signs of sandstorms, to tell time by the angle of the sun, to navigate by stars they had never seen before. They learned which insects were safe to eat and which would make you sick. They learned to dig shallow graves in sand that would not hold a body, and to say goodbye to friends whose names they would never speak again. But more than anything, they learned this. Water was life. Everything else, no food, shelter, ammunition, was secondary. You could fight hungry. You could fight exhausted. But you could not fight without water. And so they became obsessed with it. Private Giovanni Conti spent hours every day thinking about water. Not in the abstract, but in vivid, aching detail. He remembered the fountain in his village square, the way the water splashed cool and clear over the stones. He remembered the river where he used to swim as a boy, the shock of cold against his skin on a summer afternoon. He remembered his mother pouring him a glass of water at the dinner table, condensation beading on the outside of the glass, and the way it tasted like nothing and everything all at once. Now, his daily ration was half a liter, sometimes less. He drank it slowly in tiny sips, trying to make it last. But the thirst never went away. It gnawed at him, a constant ache in his throat, his mouth, his bones. His lips cracked and bled, his tongue swelled, his urine turned dark, then stopped altogether. The medics told him he was dehydrated, as if he didn't know. But in that suffering, something else emerged. Ingenuity. The soldiers learned to collect water from the most unlikely places. They would wake before dawn and spread their blankets on the sand, waited at the corners. In the brief coolness of early morning, dew would condense on the fabric. Not much, just a few drops, but enough to wring into a cup and drink. They dug shallow pits and lined them with canvas, hoping to catch rainwater. Rain was rare, but when it came, they scrambled to capture every drop, holding out canteens and helmets and cupped hands. Some learned from the Bedouins, the nomadic people who had survived in the desert for centuries. The Bedouins showed them how to find moisture beneath the surface, how to crack open certain roots and suck the liquid from inside, how to conserve sweat by moving slowly, breathing through the nose, staying in the shade whenever possible. The soldiers bartered for this knowledge. Cigarettes mostly, watches, anything of value, because knowledge, in the desert, was worth more than gold. Corporal Dante Ricci, stationed near an abandoned well outside Benghazi, spent 3 days digging through sand and rubble to reach the water below. The well had been dynamited by retreating British forces, filled with debris and stone. But Ricci was desperate. He dug with his hands, with a broken shovel, with pieces of metal scavenged from wrecked trucks. His palms blistered and bled. His back screamed. But he kept digging. On the 3rd day he struck water. It was brackish, foul-tasting, possibly contaminated, but it was wet. He filled every canteen he had, then called his platoon over. They drank carefully, sparingly, knowing it might make them sick, but also knowing that thirst would kill them faster. 3 men got dysentery, but the rest survived another week. And in the desert, a week was everything. Survival also meant improvisation. When the trucks broke down, and when they always broke down, the soldiers became mechanics. They learned to strip engines, to replace broken parts with scavenged pieces, to coax dying vehicles back to life with wire and prayer. When their uniforms disintegrated under the sun and the sand, they sewed patches from whatever they could find. Blankets, tents, pieces of canvas torn from wrecked vehicles. When their boots fell apart, they wrapped their feet in cloth and kept walking. And when the food ran out, they ate whatever they could find. Lizards roasted over small fires, insects crushed and mixed with hardtack to add protein, roots dug from the sand, bitter and fibrous but filling. Some soldiers stationed near the coast learned to fish using makeshift lines and hooks fashioned from wire. The fish they caught were small, bony, and salted by the sea, but they were food, and food, like water, was life. But more than any technique, more than any trick or improvisation, the thing that kept the soldiers alive was each other, brotherhood. In the isolation of the desert, where days blurred into weeks and weeks into months, the men around you became everything. They were your family, your anchor, your reason to keep moving when every part of you wanted to stop. Private Matteo Di Stefano, separated from his unit during a sandstorm, wandered alone for 2 days. He had no water, no sense of direction, no hope. The sun beat down on him. The sand stretched endlessly in every direction. He was ready to lie down and die. And then he heard voices. A patrol from another Italian company, searching for survivors, found him collapsed in the sand. They gave him water. Half a canteen split among 4 men. They carried him when he couldn't walk. They shared their rations, even though they had barely enough for themselves. Why? He asked later, when he had recovered enough to speak. So you don't even know me. One of the soldiers, a corporal from Naples, just shrugged. Because you're one of us, that was all. That was everything. In the desert, rank mattered less than it did anywhere else. Officers and enlisted men suffered the same thirst, the same heat, the same fear. They dug the same holes, ate the same rations, and died the same deaths. And in that shared suffering, something deeper than hierarchy emerged. Trust. When Sergeant Pietro Lombardi collapsed from heat stroke, his men carried him for 3 miles to the nearest field hospital. They took turns, 2 men at a time, stumbling through the sand under the full weight of his body. No one ordered them to do it. They just did. Because that was what you did. You carried the ones who couldn't walk. You shared your water with the ones who had none. You stayed with the wounded, even when staying meant risking your own life. Not because it was duty, because it was human. Lieutenant Carlo Ferri, writing in his journal by the dim light of a lantern, tried to put it into words. We have lost everything here. Our pride, our strength, our belief that any of this matters. But we have not lost each other, and maybe that is enough. Maybe that is the only thing that matters. He was killed the next day by an artillery shell, but his words survived, and they captured something essential about the Italian soldiers. In North Africa, they did not win battles. They did not change the course of the war. They did not earn glory or recognition or remembrance, but they held on to each other, to life, to the small, stubborn hope that maybe, somehow they would see home again. And when the end finally came, when the war in North Africa collapsed and the armies surrendered, and the survivors were marched away into captivity, they carried that with them, the memory of the desert, and the memory of the men who stood beside them because in a place where everything else was taken away, brotherhood was the one thing that could not be burned. Buried or broken, it endured like the sand, like the sun, like the ghosts of the men who never made it home, silent, invisible, eternal. By the spring of 1943, the war in North Africa was dying, not quickly like a sudden wound, but slowly, like a body bleeding out in the sand, too weak to fight, too stubborn to stop. The Italian and German forces, once triumphant, once feared, were now trapped between the British Eighth Army advancing from the east and the American forces pushing from the west, trapped in Tunisia, a shrinking pocket of land where supply lines had collapsed, where fuel and food and hope had run dry, trapped in a war they could no longer win. The soldiers knew it. You could see it in their faces, the hollow eyes, the slumped shoulders, the way they moved like men underwater, every step an effort, every breath a negotiation with exhaustion. Private Lorenzo Gallo sat in a shallow trench outside Tunis, staring at the horizon. He had not eaten in 2 days. His canteen had been empty for longer. Around him his comrades lay scattered in the sand, too tired to dig deeper, too numb to care. They're coming, someone said. No one asked who. Everyone knew the Allies were closing in, from the air, from the ground, from every direction. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide, and no reason left to fight. The Italian command had stopped issuing orders. Or maybe the orders were still being given, but they no longer reached the front lines. Communications had broken down. Radios were dead. Messengers didn't return. In the chaos, units fragmented. Some tried to retreat south into the desert, hoping to find a way back to Libya. Most didn't make it. The desert, indifferent as always, swallowed them. Others stayed where they were, waiting for relief that would never come, for supplies that would never arrive, for a miracle that did not exist. Sergeant Aldo Marino watched as his company, once 60 strong, dwindled to 15, then 10, then 6. The rest were dead, wounded, missing, or simply gone. One morning, a young private named Emilio stood up in the middle of the camp, dropped his rifle, and started walking east. "Where are you going?" Marino called after him. Emilio didn't turn around. "Home." He walked into the desert and disappeared. No one went after him. What was the point? The siege of Tunisia lasted weeks, months, depending on how you counted. But for the men trapped inside, time had stopped meaning anything. There was only now, the endless, suffocating now of heat and hunger, and the slow realization that they were not going to survive. And then the order came, not from Rome, not from Mussolini, but from the German High Command, relayed through whatever channels still functioned. Surrender. Lay down your weapons. Raise the white flag. It's over. For some, the order was a relief. Corporal Francesco Bellini, his feet raw with blisters, his stomach cramping from hunger, felt something inside him let go when he heard the words. He sat down in the sand and wept, not from sadness but from the sheer, overwhelming release of it. He didn't have to fight anymore. He didn't have to pretend there was a reason to keep going. He could stop. But for others, the order was agony. Lieutenant Giuseppe Rossi refused to believe it at first. "We can't surrender," he said, his voice cracking. "We're soldiers. We're Italians. We don't just give up." His sergeant looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. "We already did. We just didn't know it." Rossi stood there, rifle in hand, staring at the men around him. Boys, most of them. Starving, broken, defeated. He thought about ordering them to fight, to make a last stand, to die with honor, to prove that they had not been cowards. But what honor was there in dying for nothing? What glory in a battle that would not be remembered? Slowly he set down his rifle. The surrender began quietly. Across the front, Italian and German soldiers emerged from their positions, hands raised, faces blank, moving like sleepwalkers. They walked toward the Allied lines in long, ragged columns, thousands of them, tens of thousands, a tide of defeat washing across the desert. Some burned their weapons before surrendering. Others simply dropped them in the sand. Private Matteo Bianchi watched as an officer took down the Italian flag from a makeshift pole and folded it carefully, as though it still mattered. As though flags meant anything in a place like this, the Allies were waiting. British and American soldiers, rifles ready, watched as the Italians approached. Some looked relieved. Others looked wary. A few looked almost sympathetic. But most just looked tired of the war, tired of the desert, tired of everything. The prisoners were searched, their possessions taken, watches, knives, photographs. Then they were marched away, barefoot or in broken boots, under the same sun that had tortured them for years. They walked for miles. No water was given, no food, just the long, shuffling march across the sand surrounded by guards who barely acknowledged their existence. Men collapsed along the way. Some were helped up. Others were left behind. Corporal Luca Martini stumbled and fell to his knees. His legs wouldn't carry him anymore. A British soldier walked over, looked down at him, then gestured for him to get up. Martini tried. He couldn't. The soldier sighed, then called over a medic. They gave Martini water, just a mouthful, and helped him to his feet. He kept walking, not because he wanted to, but because there was nothing else to do. The prisoner of war camps were hastily constructed enclosures in the desert, barbed wire fences, tents, sometimes not even that. The Italians were herded inside and left to wait, for what they didn't know. Food came eventually, rations sparse but better than what they had been eating. Medical care arrived, though there were far more wounded than doctors, and slowly the realization set in. The war was over. For them, at least. Some felt relief. Others felt shame. Most felt nothing at all, just a vast, empty numbness that filled the space where hope and fear had once been. Private Antonio Rizzo, sitting in a camp outside Tunis, stared at his hands. They were cracked, scarred, filthy. He tried to remember what they had looked like before the war. Before the desert, he couldn't. A fellow prisoner, a man from Rome, sat down beside him. "What will you tell them?" he asked quietly. "When you go home, what will you say?" Rizzo thought about it for a long time. Then he shook his head. "Nothing. I'll say nothing." "Why?" "Because they won't understand." "They can't. Unless you were here, you can't understand," the man nodded. "Then who will remember?" Rizzo didn't answer, because he didn't have an answer. In the months that followed, hundreds of thousands of Italian soldiers were shipped to prisoner of war camps in Africa, in Britain, in the United States. They spent the rest of the war behind wire, working on farms, building roads, waiting for a future that felt impossibly far away. Some never made it home. Disease took them, accidents, the slow erosion of hope. Those who did return found an Italy that had changed, a country that had switched sides, that had been torn apart by civil war, that wanted desperately to forget the years of fascism and failure. The North African veterans were told not to talk about what had happened, not to dwell on the past, not to remind people of the defeats, and so they didn't. They came home and they were silent, silent about the heat, silent about the thirst, silent about the friends they had buried in the sand, silent about the moment they laid down their rifles and raised their hands and admitted, finally, that it was over, that they had lost, that they had survived. But survival without acknowledgement is a kind of death, and for the Italian soldiers who surrendered in the sands of Tunisia, the war did not end in 1943. It ended slowly over decades, as they grew old and died and took their stories with them, until all that remained were the ghosts in the desert and the silence that swallowed them whole. By the spring of 1943, the war in North Africa was dying, not quickly like a sudden wound, but slowly, like a body bleeding out in the sand, too weak to fight, too stubborn to stop. The Italian and German forces, once triumphant, once feared, were now trapped between the British Eighth Army advancing from the east and the American forces pushing from the west, trapped in Tunisia, a shrinking pocket of land where supply lines had collapsed, where fuel and food and hope had run dry, trapped in a war they could no longer win. The soldiers knew it. You could see it in their faces, the hollow eyes, the slumped shoulders, the way they moved like men underwater, every step an effort, every breath a negotiation with exhaustion. Private Lorenzo Gallo sat in a shallow trench outside Tunis, staring at the horizon. He had not eaten in 2 days. His canteen had been empty for longer. Around him his comrades lay scattered in the sand, too tired to dig deeper, too numb to care. "They're coming," someone said. No one asked who. Everyone knew the Allies were closing in, from the air, from the ground, from every direction. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide, and no reason left to fight. The Italian command had stopped issuing orders. Or maybe the orders were still being given, but they no longer reached the front lines. Communications had broken down. Radios were dead. Messengers didn't return. In the chaos, units fragmented. Some tried to retreat south into the desert, hoping to find a way back to Libya. Most didn't make it. The desert, indifferent as always, swallowed them. Others stayed where they were, waiting for relief that would never come, for supplies that would never arrive, for a miracle that did not exist. Sergeant Aldo Marino watched as his company, once 60 strong, dwindled to 15, then 10, then 6. The rest were dead, wounded, missing, or simply gone. One morning, a young private named Emilio stood up in the middle of the camp, dropped his rifle, and started walking east. "Where are you going?" Marino called after him. Emilio didn't turn around. "Home." He walked into the desert and disappeared. No one went after him. What was the point? The siege of Tunisia lasted weeks, months, depending on how you counted. But for the men trapped inside, time had stopped meaning anything. There was only now, the endless, suffocating now of heat and hunger, and the slow realization that they were not going to survive. And then the order came, not from Rome, not from Mussolini, but from the German High Command, relayed through whatever channels still functioned. Surrender. Lay down your weapons. Raise the white flag. It's over. For some, the order was a relief. Corporal Francesco Bellini, his feet raw with blisters, his stomach cramping from hunger, felt something inside him let go when he heard the words. He sat down in the sand and wept, not from sadness but from the sheer, overwhelming release of it. He didn't have to fight anymore. He didn't have to pretend there was a reason to keep going. He could stop. But for others, the order was agony. Lieutenant Giuseppe Rossi refused to believe it at first. "We can't surrender," he said, his voice cracking. "We're soldiers. We're Italians. We don't just give up." His sergeant looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. "We already did. We just didn't know it." Rossi stood there, rifle in hand, staring at the men around him. Boys, most of them. Starving, broken, defeated. He thought about ordering them to fight, to make a last stand, to die with honor, to prove that they had not been cowards. But what honor was there in dying for nothing? What glory in a battle that would not be remembered? Slowly he set down his rifle. The surrender began quietly. Across the front, Italian and German soldiers emerged from their positions, hands raised, faces blank, moving like sleepwalkers. They walked toward the Allied lines in long, ragged columns, thousands of them, tens of thousands, a tide of defeat washing across the desert. Some burned their weapons before surrendering. Others simply dropped them in the sand. Private Matteo Bianchi watched as an officer took down the Italian flag from a makeshift pole and folded it carefully, as though it still mattered. As though flags meant anything in a place like this, the Allies were waiting. British and American soldiers, rifles ready, watched as the Italians approached. Some looked relieved. Others looked wary. A few looked almost sympathetic. But most just looked tired of the war, tired of the desert, tired of everything. The prisoners were searched, their possessions taken, watches, knives, photographs. Then they were marched away, barefoot or in broken boots, under the same sun that had tortured them for years. They walked for miles. No water was given, no food, just the long, shuffling march across the sand surrounded by guards who barely acknowledged their existence. Men collapsed along the way. Some were helped up. Others were left behind. Corporal Luca Martini stumbled and fell to his knees. His legs wouldn't carry him anymore. A British soldier walked over, looked down at him, then gestured for him to get up. Martini tried. He couldn't. The soldier sighed, then called over a medic. They gave Martini water, just a mouthful, and helped him to his feet. He kept walking, not because he wanted to, but because there was nothing else to do. The prisoner of war camps were hastily constructed enclosures in the desert, barbed wire fences, tents, sometimes not even that. The Italians were herded inside and left to wait. For what, they didn't know. Food came eventually. Rations sparse but better than what they had been eating. Medical care arrived, though there were far more wounded than doctors, and slowly the realization set in. The war was over. For them, at least. Some felt relief. Others felt shame. Most felt nothing at all, just a vast, empty numbness that filled the space where hope and fear had once been. Private Antonio Rizzo, sitting in a camp outside Tunis, stared at his hands. They were cracked, scarred, filthy. He tried to remember what they had looked like before the war. Before the desert, he couldn't. A fellow prisoner, a man from Rome, sat down beside him. "What will you tell them?" he asked quietly. "When you go home, what will you say?" Rizzo thought about it for a long time. Then he shook his head. "Nothing. I'll say nothing." "Why?" "Because they won't understand." "They can't. Unless you were here, you can't understand," the man nodded. "Then who will remember?" Rizzo didn't answer, because he didn't have an answer. In the months that followed, hundreds of thousands of Italian soldiers were shipped to prisoner of war camps in Africa, in Britain, in the United States. They spent the rest of the war behind wire, working on farms, building roads, waiting for a future that felt impossibly far away. Some never made it home. Disease took them, accidents, the slow erosion of hope. Those who did return found an Italy that had changed, a country that had switched sides, that had been torn apart by civil war, that wanted desperately to forget the years of fascism and failure. The North African veterans were told not to talk about what had happened, not to dwell on the past, not to remind people of the defeats, and so they didn't. They came home and they were silent, silent about the heat, silent about the thirst, silent about the friends they had buried in the sand, silent about the moment they laid down their rifles and raised their hands and admitted, finally, that it was over, that they had lost, that they had survived. But survival without acknowledgement is a kind of death, and for the Italian soldiers who surrendered in the sands of Tunisia, the war did not end in 1943. It ended slowly over decades, as they grew old and died and took their stories with them, until all that remained were the ghosts in the desert and the silence that swallowed them whole. When the war ended, Italy wanted to forget. It wanted to erase the years of fascism, the alliance with Nazi Germany, the invasions and occupations and atrocities committed in its name. It wanted to rebuild itself as something new, democratic, peaceful, reborn from the ashes of dictatorship. And in that rebuilding, there was no room for the men who had fought in North Africa. They were inconvenient memories, reminders of a failed empire, a lost war, a national humiliation that the new Italy desperately wanted to bury, and so it did. The soldiers who returned from prisoner of war camps in 1945 and 1946 came home to a country that did not celebrate them. There were no parades, no medals, no ceremonies of honor. Instead, there was silence, a cold, deliberate silence. Corporal Vittorio Conti arrived back in his village outside Florence on a grey afternoon in October 1946. He had been gone for 6 years. 6 years of desert heat, British captivity, and slow starvation in camps where hope came in the form of Red Cross parcels that arrived once a month, if at all. He walked through the streets he had known since childhood, past houses where neighbours had once waved and called his name. Now they turned away. Some closed their shutters as he passed. His mother hugged him at the door, tears streaming down her face. But his father stood in the doorway and said nothing. Just looked at him with eyes full of something Vittorio couldn't name. Disappointment, maybe, or shame. That night at dinner, no one asked him about the war, not about the desert, not about the battles, not about the men who had died beside him. They ate in silence, and Vittorio understood. He was not supposed to talk about it. None of them were. Across Italy, the same scene repeated. Veterans returned to villages and cities where people wanted to move on, to forget, to pretend the war had been someone else's fault. The new government, eager to distance itself from Mussolini's regime, did not honor the soldiers. There were no pensions for North African veterans, no recognition of their service, no acknowledgement of their suffering. They had fought for the wrong side, and in post-war Italy, that was an unforgivable sin. Lieutenant Carlo Mancini, who had survived Tobruk and El Alamein and the long surrender in Tunisia, tried to speak at a town council meeting in 1948. He wanted to propose a memorial for the men from his town who had died in North Africa, a simple plaque, a place where their names would be remembered. The council voted it down. "We do not memorialize fascist wars," the mayor said. Mancini stood there, hands trembling, and asked quietly, "What about the men? Do we memorialize them?" The mayor did not answer. Mancini left the meeting and never spoke of it again. The silence was not just political. It was personal. The veterans themselves, scarred by shame and trauma, often chose not to speak. They buried their memories the way they had buried their friends, quickly, without ceremony, in places no one would find. Private Domenico Ferraro, who had lost 3 fingers to frostbite during a winter campaign in the desert mountains, would hide his hand in his pocket when meeting people. When his children asked about his missing fingers, he told them it was a farming accident. It was easier than explaining the truth, easier than reliving the nights when the temperature dropped below freezing and there were no gloves, no fires, no shelter. Easier than remembering the medic who had sawed through frozen flesh with a dull blade, while Ferraro bit down on a piece of leather to keep from screaming. Some things were better left buried, and so the stories disappeared. Diaries were thrown away or locked in attics. Photographs were hidden. Letters were burned. The men who had survived the desert carried it with them in silence, a weight invisible to everyone else, but crushing nonetheless, and the world forgot them. Historians writing about World War II focused on the major battles, the turning points, the heroes and villains who shaped the outcome. North Africa became a chapter about Rommel and Montgomery, about El Alamein and Operation Torch, about the Allied march toward victory. The Italians were footnotes, mentioned briefly as Rommel's allies, dismissed quickly as ineffective, erased almost entirely from the narrative. Even in Italy, the story of the North African campaign was rewritten. Textbooks glossed over it. Documentaries ignored it. When the war was discussed, it was the resistance that mattered. The brave Italians who fought against fascism, who sabotaged the Germans, who died as heroes in the final years of the war. The men who had fought in the desert did not fit that story, and so they were left out. Sergeant Giuseppe Mariani, who had marched through 120-degree heat and watched his friends die of thirst, lived to be 78 years old. He never told his grandchildren about the war. When they asked, he would smile and change the subject. After he died, his daughter found a box in his closet. Inside were letters he had written but never sent, a faded photograph of his platoon, and a small notebook filled with names. Dozens of them, written in careful script. "Who are these?" she asked her mother. "The ones who didn't come home," her mother said quietly. He never forgot them, but the world did. The graves scattered across North Africa, in Libya, in Tunisia, in Egypt, were left to the desert. Some were marked, most were not. The sand shifted, covered them, erased them. The wooden crosses rotted. The names faded. In Tobruk, in Benghazi, in the wastelands outside El Alamein, the bones of Italian soldiers lie beneath the dunes, unmarked and unnamed. No one tends them, no one visits, no one remembers, and perhaps that is the cruelest part of all. Not the dying, but the forgetting, Because these men were not abstractions. They were not statistics or symbols or propaganda. They were sons and brothers and fathers. They were farmers and clerks and students. They were boys who had never wanted to fight, who had been sent to a desert they couldn't understand, to die for a cause they didn't believe in. And when they came home, those who came home, they were told to be silent, to forget, to let it go. And so they did, until the memories became ghosts, until the stories became dust, until all that remained was the desert itself, vast, empty, indifferent, still burning under the sun, still holding the secrets of the men it swallowed, still waiting for someone to remember. But no one came, and in the silence that followed, the Italian soldiers of North Africa faded from history, not with a final battle or a tragic end, but with the slow, quiet erasure of men whose suffering was too inconvenient to acknowledge. They became the forgotten, the invisible, the ghosts beneath the sand. And as the years turned into decades, and the decades into generations, their names were lost, their faces were lost, their voices were lost. But the desert remembers, it always does, and perhaps, in the end, that is enough. There is a question that lingers in the empty spaces of history, a question that has no easy answer, no clean resolution, no comforting conclusion. It is this: what does it mean to endure? Not to win, not to triumph or conquer or achieve glory, but simply to endure, to survive when survival seems impossible, to keep breathing when the air burns your lungs, to take one more step when every part of you is screaming to stop, to hold on, not because you believe it will get better, but because letting go means dying. The Italian soldiers who fought in North Africa were not heroes in the way we usually understand the word. They did not win great battles. They did not change the course of history. They did not earn monuments or medals or the gratitude of nations. They simply endured, and perhaps that is the most human thing of all, because endurance is not glorious. It is not cinematic. It does not make for stirring speeches or triumphant music. It is quiet. It is painful. It is the slow, grinding work of refusing to disappear. In the 120-degree heat of the Libyan desert, endurance meant waking up every morning and deciding not to die. It meant rationing water until your throat felt like sandpaper and your tongue swelled in your mouth. It meant walking on blistered feet until the skin peeled away and every step left blood in the sand. It meant watching your friends collapse and knowing you couldn't help them. It meant burying them in shallow graves and moving on because there was no other choice. It meant surviving not because you were strong, but because you were stubborn. Because some part of you, some small flickering part, refused to let the desert win. Private Luca Moretti, delirious from heat stroke and dehydration, crawled for 3 hours across the sand after his convoy was destroyed. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't know if he would make it. He just kept crawling. When a German patrol found him, he was barely conscious. His skin was burned black. His lips had split open. His eyes were crusted shut with sand and dried blood, but he was alive. They asked him later why he didn't stop, why he didn't just lie down and let it end. He didn't have an answer, because endurance is not rational. It is not something you choose in a moment of clarity. It is something deeper than choice. An instinct, a reflex, a desperate, animal need to keep existing, even when existence is agony. Sergeant Aldo Ferri, captured at Tobruk and marched for days without food or water, watched men around him drop like stones. Young men, strong men, men who should have survived, but they didn't, and he did. Not because he was better than them, not because he deserved it more, but because his body, for reasons he would never understand, kept going. That is what endurance looks like. Not strength, not heroism, just the stubborn, inexplicable refusal to stop. And when the war finally ended, when the guns fell silent and the survivors were sent home, they carried that endurance with them. They carried it through the years of silence when no one wanted to hear their stories, through the decades of being forgotten, of being written out of history, of being told that their suffering didn't matter. They carried it through nightmares that never stopped, through guilt that never faded, through memories that burned as hot as the desert sun, and they endured that. 2 Corporal Francesco Bellini, who had wept when the order to surrender came, lived for 53 more years. He worked as a mechanic, married, raised 2 children, and never once spoke about North Africa. But every summer, when the temperature climbed and the air grew heavy and still, he would stand in his workshop and close his eyes. And for a moment he was back there, in the sand, in the heat, in the endless burning now, and then he would open his eyes and return to his work, because that was what he had learned in the desert. You endure, Not because it's easy, not because it's fair, but because the alternative is to disappear. The Italian soldiers of North Africa did not get the ending they deserved. There were no homecoming parades, no grateful nation, no acknowledgement of what they had survived, but they did get something else. They got to live, not all of them, not even most of them, but some, and those who lived carried the memory of the ones who didn't. They carried the names, the faces, the moments that should not be forgotten even though the world had forgotten them. Private Giovanni Conti, who had obsessed about water for 2 years in the desert, kept a journal after the war. In it, he wrote the names of every man in his platoon who had died. 47 names. He wrote where they died, when they died, and when he knew it, how they died. He wrote it all down because he was afraid that if he didn't, they would vanish completely, as if they had never existed, as if their suffering had been for nothing. And maybe it was. Maybe there is no meaning to be found in the North African campaign. No lesson, no moral, no redemption. Maybe it was just heat and sand and death. Maybe it was just young men sent to die for old men's dreams. Maybe it was just one more tragedy in a war full of tragedies. But the men who endured it were real. Their pain was real. Their fear was real. Their courage, quiet. Unglamorous, unrecognized, and was real, and that matters, even if the world doesn't remember them, even if history moved on without them, even if their names are lost, and their graves are unmarked, and their stories are buried beneath the sand. They mattered, because they were human, and humanity, at its core, is about endurance. It is about surviving the unsurvivable. It is about holding on when everything is falling apart. It is about taking one more breath, one more step, one more moment, not because it's heroic, but because it's what we do. The desert took many things from the Italian soldiers who fought there. It took their health, their innocence, their belief that the world was fair or just or kind, but it did not take their humanity. And in the end, perhaps that is the only victory that matters. Not the battles won or lost, not the territory gained or surrendered, but the simple, stubborn fact of survival, of endurance, of refusing to be erased. And so we remember them now, not as heroes, not as villains, but as men. Men who walked through fire and came out scarred. Men who faced impossible odds and kept going. Men who suffered in silence and died forgotten. Men who endured, beneath the sun that never forgave, beneath the sand that never forgot, beneath the sky that stretches, still over the empty places where they fought and bled and died. They are there, still in the silence, in the heat, in the memory of what it means to be human in a place that tried to take that away. And as long as someone remembers, even one person, even for one moment, they have not disappeared. They endured, and they endure still.